Okay. Once again, it's great to have Dr. Travis Williams back with us here at King. And last week he did a fantastic lecture for our foundation students up in the Fine Arts Building. And he introduced the whole concept of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so now this is part 2 of his lecture series, Understanding the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, Dr. Williams is an expert in New Testament and in particular 1 Peter, right? Yes. And he is an assistant professor at Tusculum in Greenville, Tennessee. Dr. Williams, thank you for coming back to be with us. It's all you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out and braving the monsoon. It looks like it's dying down a little bit. But this is part 2. So I know that you were here for the last lecture. The very first lecture, what we covered was the text, how the Dead Sea Scrolls inform our understanding of the text, and how the text was passed down to us from way back then up until now. How the implications for today. Today, we're going to look at just a broad overview. So that was kind of more of a why does this matter? Why are these texts important at all? This today will be just a general overview of the scrolls, what they are, where they were found, all that kind of stuff. In terms of, I guess, significance, this will be a lot of information. So this is very information-packed. It might be kind of boring because it is a lot of just facts and figures and those kind of things. Next week, hopefully, we will finish up the third part of the series. And next week it'll be more of the why is this important? How do the scrolls help us understand anything about the ancient world, the Bible, ancient Judaism, early Christianity? So it'll be more, I guess, applicable and more interesting probably. But we have to first kind of set the groundwork, and that's what we're going to do today. So, first of all, the Dead Sea Scrolls, what are they? Here's a basic definition. These are over 900 Jewish texts. And again, I say Jewish because sometimes people confuse these and think, well, there must be something about Christianity. Jesus surely has to be part of these. It's not. These are Jewish texts, over 900 of these, dating from about 200 years before Jesus, so 3rd century AD or CE. They were found beginning in 1947. So we have these middle of the 20th century. These were first discovered. And they were found in a place called Qumran. And I'll show you a picture of this. Qumran is located just in the northwestern corner, the edge of the border of the Dead Sea. So this is right to the east of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, that area. That's what we're looking at. And they were discovered in caves. These are ancient manuscripts. Many of them are fragmentary manuscripts. They were discovered in these caves all along this Qumran area. Many of the texts were just dumped. So some of the texts we have, they were actually in large jars. They were stored there. But many of the texts, especially in these 2 caves here, they were just dumped on the ground, and they hid these in a hurry. So this is the area in which they were found along these caves. Some of them caves are man-made. Some of them are natural caves. But the first part, before we get into the actual texts themselves, what they are, why they're significant, I want to look at first how they were discovered. So where did we find these? How were they found? How were they discovered? I'm going to begin with this video. So,
sometimes history changes because of the smallest of things, like a lost goat. It's 1947, the year the State of Israel is formed, and the errant goat belongs to a young Bedouin boy in the Judean desert. Thinking it's disappeared into a cave, he tosses in a rock, hoping to scare it out. Instead, he hears something shatter. Frightened of what might lie inside, the boy enlists his cousin, Mohammed El-Dahid, to explore the cave. What they find is a disappointment. No goat, no treasure. Just some broken pottery and several ancient jars containing scrolls wrapped in linen. Mohammed El-Dahid gathers the loot and puts it in a sack. value of his treasure, he hitches the sack to his Bedouin tent pole, where it hangs for days. Eventually, he sells pieces of the scrolls to a shoemaker in Bethlehem for the equivalent of $4. They would turn out to be the tip of the iceberg. The first cache of what would swell to some 900 texts of profound religious and historical significance. Practically the only surviving biblical documents written before 100 AD. Today, the Dead Sea Scrolls sit quietly in the Israel Museum's shrine of the book, whispering stories of a distant past and speaking to the earliest days of Judaism and perhaps the origins of Christianity.
So you can see that the story itself of how the scrolls were discovered, it sounds almost like something out of a movie. You know, you have something this almost Indiana Jones-like. It just so happened that they stumbled on these. Now here's the story. Now how much of this is actual truth we're still trying to piece together, but the story goes this way. Sometime around November 1946, between there and February 1947. So with the stories that we get are kind of in conflict. But around this time, in this area, so the northwest part of the Dead Sea area, there was a tribe of Bedouin, which are just a semi-nomadic group that travels around, and they're herders and shepherds. According to the story, there were three shepherds. There were three shepherds that were out keeping this flock. While they were keeping their flock, one of their goats wandered off, according to their story, and they went to look for him. And while they did, one of the shepherds had a rock, and he throws it up into a cave. You can see the cave up here. He throws it up into the cave, hoping maybe to scare the goat out if it's actually truly up there. But when he throws it up there, he hears something shatter. Something must be in there. This kind of piques his interest a little bit. You have a picture here. This is a close-up of the cave. You can see this. This wasn't cut out like this. This wasn't cut out like this before. This is obviously due to archaeologists who are going in there and digging around. All we had is just a very small opening. Very small. So he had to climb up, first of all, and get down into the cave. And then what he found in there was very interesting. He found jars, these very large jars, and many of the jars contained texts, very ancient texts with writing that he obviously could not read. These are very, very old texts. Now, whether that is how these texts happen or not, this may be something, maybe just a tall tale, because we know that Bedouin in this area were very well known for being treasure hunters. They went and scoured these caves up in the area looking for some kind of treasure like this. So whether that's how it happened or not, but this is the story that's told. This is obviously a very, very popular story. Now, what did they find? What they found, the very first go-around at least, were three texts. One was a complete copy of the book of Isaiah. It's complete, the whole book of Isaiah intact. The second was what we call the community rule, or the rule of community. This is a text that we'll look at in just a second. This was a rules and regulations manual of a group that we'd never heard of before until this. The third text they found was from the Pesher Habakkuk, which was just a commentary, a commenting on the text of Habakkuk. Again, we had never seen these two texts before. These were firsts for us. Now, they took these, and of course, they didn't realize what they had, so they didn't know. They knew that these were old texts, maybe they can get some money out of them. So they take these texts back to their tent, and they hang them on the tent pole. So they're just hanging there, and days pass, and days and days and days pass, just hanging there. They hang them for a long time, not even thinking anything about it. What's interesting about that is this. According to some accounts, one of the texts that they had brought back, that we don't have now, one of the texts they brought back, a bundle of scrolls, were taken by young children in the group, and they played with them on the ground. They kicked them around, and one of the adults, not knowing what it was, took one of the scrolls and threw it out, just threw it into the wind, and it was lost. Now, if you think about it in terms of how important that could have been, these were worth, they're priceless, ancient documents, and that we now don't have that. Later, they went back to find it, and they couldn't find where it was. But to think about what this could have been, who knows what the text might have been.
Maybe it was Esther.
Maybe it was Esther. It could have been Esther.
There goes Esther.
There you go. But we don't know. But what they did is they took these texts around, again, looking for someone to buy them. They didn't know what they had. So eventually they settled for a very, very small amount of money. but they take them down to various antique dealers in Bethlehem. You know, would you like to buy this? No one's interested in buying these texts because no one knows what it is yet. They eventually take him to a man by the name of Kando. Kando's a leather merchant in Bethlehem and a Syrian Orthodox. And he takes them and he makes this deal with another Syrian Orthodox leader called Mar Samuel. And Mar Samuel buys them and realizes what they are. He takes them to some actual scholars and gets an opinion, and they realize what they have. Well, after they realize this, one of the shepherds goes back then, he goes back then to the cave, and some say he goes back to a different cave. We don't know for sure. But he goes back to maybe the same cave to find more. So he brings out more. And this time he finds 4 more. He finds another copy of Isaiah. We call this Isaiah B. Not complete, but another good copy. He finds the War Scroll, which is, this is a scroll of basically an ancient apocalypse. What's going to happen in this great war against the nations at the end. He finds some Thanksgiving hymns, very much like the Psalms. These are written by a community. Again, we didn't have these before. Retelling of certain parts of Genesis. Again, we'd never seen these texts before this discovery. This was huge. So after they realized what they have, then this is where the race is kind of on. They realize this is the biggest discovery that we've had in many years. And the race is on to find more. They realize these are in caves. So the race is on between the Bedouin and between the archaeologists. And what's interesting is to see who got what. There were 11 caves in total. And of these, the Bedouin found 5 of the caves. The archaeologists discovered 6 of the caves. And it might seem like that's good, but the archaeologists actually found the ones that weren't as important. So they found the Bedouin found Cave 1, which was obviously huge. They had many of the complete scrolls, the biggest scrolls. They found Cave 1. They also found Cave 11, which was another important cave. But most important is they found Cave 4. Cave 4 was the gold mine. This is really the important one. This was the jackpot. This is where most of the text from the scrolls, this is where it comes from. There were thousands and thousands of fragments in this one cave alone. And this is what it looks like inside. This is Cave 4. 75% of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have, all the 900 texts, 75% comes from this cave alone. And what we found is, inside this cave, the texts were just dumped. They weren't placed in nice, jars. They were just dumped. It was just piled. It was a very last-minute ditch effort to get rid of these things and hide them before something happened. We'll look at what happened in a second. This is what it looks like. I'm going to show you another clip, just very quickly, of someone discussing this cave and why it was important.
And a profitable one. The Bedouin continued to comb the cliffs. The greatest discovery of all was to come at the end of September 1952. The Bedouin unearthed another cache of scrolls in a chamber hollowed out of a plateau.
It's certainly a lot more difficult getting down here than it was 30 years ago when this was much less eroded. But I still remember this fantastic view where you could stand right on the edge and look out towards the Dead Sea. This gully didn't exist in the 1st century. This gully was eroded subsequently. This would have been part of the flat surface around the settlement. But all of that view, of course, is of much less importance than what they found in here. This was the greatest, richest discovery that they made. The Romans came a little more quickly than they anticipated, and before they fled, they just dumped the stuff here. In fact, it must have been so late that some of the soldiers obviously saw it, because you can see that some of the manuscripts were torn. See? So they were spread out, something like 15,000 fragments of over 500 manuscripts. Then, you see this very soft, marly rock. You see, I could take it apart with my fingers. That then had the added disadvantage of, as this crumbled, it spread itself all over the manuscript. That would have taken several centuries to form. And so it's one of the most important arguments for showing that they were not put in the caves at, say, the beginning of the 20th century. The Bedouin found about 10,000 fragments, then the archaeologists found others, and they had to sift every bit of clay or sand because even a single letter would be important.
So you can see this was the gold mine. This is where a lot of what we have came from. This was a very, very important cave. Now, with this, the discovery of Cave 4, things changed. Because before this, all we had almost complete manuscripts, intact, very easy to read, and this could be published by just one or two scholars. But with this, with all this huge amount of text, all of them small, tiny fragments, this took a team. So an international team was constructed and brought in from around the world to work on this. And this took years and years and years and years. And in fact, it took so long for these texts to be put back together that conspiracy theories grew up. That people claimed that the Catholic Church was involved with this, the Catholic Church was hiding things, the text contains something that disproved Catholic teaching, and so therefore they were suppressing it. Of course, none of that's true, but it made for good publication. So eventually these texts were published back up. They were finally published, and now actually we have access to the text, any text that we want, online for free. So you can go on, this is the deadseascrolls.org.il, to the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls collection and look at very good high-resolution photos of all these texts. So it's a very nice resource for us if you want that today. So that's how they were discovered. What are actually in them? What are these texts and what are in these texts that make them so important is the next question. Well, the biblical texts that we have, so the Isaiah scroll, all the biblical books, these are all written in Hebrew. Most of the texts that are non-biblical texts are in Hebrew as well. So we have most of them in Hebrew. 80% of the texts are written in Hebrew. We have a few texts in Aramaic, so maybe 17%, and then the very small amount in Greek. So we have a variety of different languages, but it's mostly in Hebrew. Now, what are they? What are they written on? Well, some of the texts are on parchments. Now, parchment is this. Parchment looks like this. This is a parchment. It's made from animal skins, so goat or sheep. They would go out and kill, let's say, a goat in this case, skin it, make sure that everything is cleaned off. And they would take these skins and then bind them together in some way and make a long scroll out of this. And this is called the Temple Scroll. This thing dates to 2,000 years ago. And you can see how fragmented it is and how brittle it looks. But this is, a lot of the texts are from this parchment. Other kind of text that we have is papyrus. Papyrus is kind of like an ancient paper. This is what papyrus looks like. This is another old scroll. This is 7Q5. And what they would do with papyrus, this is a plant they would cut in two. I'm going to take a strip and put it horizontally, put one vertically, and arrange these like an ancient paper. And they could write on this like you would your paper. This particular text is interesting. You can see it's a very small text. There's not much writing on it. But this is one of the few texts that's in Greek. And the only word that we can make out for sure is this particular word here. And this is kai, which is the most common word in the Greek language. But it's interesting because some scholars have postulated that this is an early copy of Mark's Gospel. And that actually Christian texts are hidden away in the caves. Now that's been debated and probably disproven by a number of scholars because you can only make out this one word. It's kind of hard to build a theory on this one word, especially because they've had to add words in other places. But we think probably more likely that this comes from part of the Hebrew Bible, the Genesis, Exodus, Jeremiah, Zechariah, somewhere else, but probably not the New Testament. Again, these are not Christian documents. You notice that the names, I had 7Q5. This is what the names mean actually. On the very first of these designations, you'll have a number. So number 1, number 2, number 7 in this case. The number in the front, this represents what cave it was found in. So cave 1 would be a 1. Usually there's a Q. The Q is for Qumran. That's the area in which it's discovered. There were some texts in Masada, others in different places. So you'd have different words here if this was not Qumran. So Q is for Qumran. Then you'll either have a number or maybe even a designation, in this case Isaiah. This is the document title or number. So first cave from Qumran, this is the copy of Isaiah. And sometimes you have a superscript here. This is just the copy number. This is in some caves, like this cave, there were 2 different copies of Isaiah. So this distinguishes copy B from copy A. That's what the names mean themselves. So parchment, papyrus, there were some ostrakhan, which are just pieces of pottery that are broken off and to write on. This particular one was just a writing exercise, probably for a novice scribe, writing his lessons there. We have a few of those. But the most interesting probably is this. We have one scroll made of copper. Now, this is a very pure copper. It's 99% copper and only 1% tin, so it's very, very valuable. Now this is interesting because we found this all rolled up. This was all in a roll, and when scholars found it, they could not open it at first because it had been oxidized, and just the very touch, it would fall apart. So we didn't know what was in it for a long time. For 3.5 years, we could not open it. Well, eventually they sent this thing to Manchester College over in the UK and built a special saw to cut the thing in half. And they cut it in half, or cut it into 23 different segments. They're these curved segments, 23 of these, to finally be able to read what was on it. And what was on it was very interesting. This scroll, again, was sheets of copper, and they were sheets of very thin copper. On this was engraved Hebrew. And they had taken this and rolled it up just like a scroll. And what we found was, this is actually an ancient treasure map. So this is an ancient map of various hidden treasures in and around Jerusalem. This is what you'll find if you read it. One of the texts says, "In the fallow of the field of the valley of Shavah, that faces southwest, in the burial chamber facing north, dig down 24 cubits, 66 talents of silver coins." So it tells you where to go, and then how to dig or whatever, and then it tells you this is what you're going to find. You're going to find this much money. And what's interesting, if you do the estimates and add all this up, we can estimate about 4,600 talents of silver and gold. And 1 talent equals somewhere between 25 and 75 pounds. But in total, we have between 58 and 174 tons of silver and gold. This is millions and millions of dollars. This is a lot of money. Now, was this real? There's been debate about whether this is real. Is this kind of a make-believe treasure, to put something on a wild goose hunt? We don't know for sure, but some will think this is possibly the treasure map for the temple treasure in Jerusalem. This represents the treasure that was stockpiled in the temple in Jerusalem that was hidden away right before the Romans came in. Because in 70 AD, the Romans came into Jerusalem and destroyed the city, burned the temple down, and the Jews, recognizing this, wanted to make sure that this was hidden away before they got there. So the idea is that this treasure was taken, hidden away, put in a safe place, and all around Jerusalem, different places, and they made a map, kind of Indiana Jones-esque kind of story, but they mapped it out so they could go back later and find where the treasure was hidden. It's very interesting. I'll show you another clip on how this text works.
In the National Archaeological Museum in Amman, Jordan, sits the most perplexing of all the texts found next to the Dead Sea. The Copper Scroll. It describes a treasure, gold and silver, measured in tons. Since its discovery in 1952, scholars have wondered why this scroll would be found among documents written by a people who swore themselves to poverty and awaited the end of the world.
The copper scroll is quite unique. It was engraved on highly pure copper, 99.9% pure copper. How did they know how to engrave on it? Why did they engrave on copper? This is a very valuable, precious material at that time. Clearly they wanted to put down information that would last.
Too brittle to be unrolled, the scroll had to be painstakingly cut into 29 pieces before it could be translated. Its contents sound like ripe pickings for the likes of an Indiana Jones.
In the mouth of the spring of the temple, vessels of silver and gold for tithe and money, the whole thing being 600 talents. In the outer valley, in the middle of the circle on the stone, buried at 17 cubits beneath it, 17 talents of silver and gold.
Written in an ancient form of Hebrew, the Copper Scroll gives precise descriptions of where large amounts of gold and silver were buried. But why would any treasure be precious to the anti-materialistic authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls? There are two distinct possibilities. It could be the treasure of the first Jewish temple, built by Solomon, and sacked by the Babylonians centuries earlier. Or, more likely, the Copper Scroll refers to the treasures of the Second Temple, destroyed by the Romans at about the time the scrolls were written.
So this is obviously, as you can imagine, a very famous scroll, very important scroll for understanding the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the next question though is what kind of documents? So we've seen different kinds of material. That's what we find. We find papyrus, parchment. different things. But what are actually on these texts that make them so valuable? And there are 4 different types of documents that we find, or 4 different kinds of texts. A few of the texts, about 100 texts we have, are so fragmentary that it's not really possible to identify them completely. So they're very fragmentary texts. We don't know what they are exactly. Some of the texts, and this is a much larger number, about 230 of the texts, about 25% of the texts, are from the Jewish scriptures, or what we would call the Bible. And these are interesting because almost every single book of what we call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, is found there, except for the book of Esther. So Esther is the only one that we did not find a copy of among the scrolls. So it seems like they were reading the same text that we read today. Now this is important for the reason I mentioned last week in the class, because of this. The text as we have, as we know it, most of the Hebrew Bible was written, let's say, over 1,000 years ago. So we have lots and lots of time between the writing down of the text and then the earliest copies that we had before the scrolls. Before the scrolls, the earliest copy that we had is from the Masoretic text, as we call it. And it was written about 1000 CE, or AD. So if you think about that, the distance between those two, we have lots and lots and lots and lots of years for copies to be made, changes to be made, additions, subtractions, all kinds of things. And so I have in here a picture of different copies with warning signs, because who knows what could have been changed along the way. But what the Dead Sea Scrolls allow us to do is get behind all these texts to find out a much earlier point, a much earlier text, and see what actually has gone on. What has gone on between this time and that, and do we have an accurate transmitted text? And what we found, I mentioned last time, was that before the time of, let's say, Jesus, the text was very fluid. So the biblical text was changed in a lot of ways. There were a variety of editions. So I mentioned before the David and Goliath story. So we had 2 different accounts of David and Goliath. In one account, we have Goliath being killed by the sword. In one account, he's killed by the stone. In one of the accounts, Goliath is 9 feet 6 inches. In another account, he's 6 feet 9 inches. So you have a variety. In one of these texts, it's about 43% shorter than the other. So it was much fluidity among these texts. But once the text was standardized, now what does that mean? Once the text became standardized, it lasted without much change at all, or variation, for a long, long time. So if this is the before Jesus, lots of variations, different editions that floated around, something happened, we don't know exactly what, but one of these texts was chosen and it became the standard edition. It then lasted without much change at all. It became what we call the Masoretic text, and then it's the text from which most of our Bibles today are translated. So one of these was chosen, it became standard, and it did not change for a long time. The scrolls showed us that. The third kind of material or text that we found in these are texts from what we call common Judaism. So texts that were read and used by lots of different Jews from around this time period, or texts that were used but not biblical texts. These are important because they actually help us understand how ancient Jews at that time viewed the canon. So which books were in, which books were out, how they understood the authority of different books. One of the interesting parts that we found is many more texts of books like 1st Enoch and Jubilees. These 2 texts obviously did not make it into the Protestant canon or the Catholic canon, but these were texts that were used by lots of Jews at this time. And in fact, many more of these books were found than some of the texts that made it into our Bibles today, which shows that probably these held a greater authority for the community than some of these other texts that we use today. So in terms of numbers, 12 copies of the book of 1st Enoch were discovered, and 15 copies of Jubilees. Now if you compare that to, let's say, the book of Joshua, which had 2 copies, it looks like this community that's preserving these texts viewed these books as more authoritative, more important for their lives than, let's say, Joshua, even though that might be important too. It's very interesting in terms of canonical thinking. The very last part of the text, the very last fourth. Yes.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Here, can you go back, will you explain to folks that may not know, if you go one more, when you say 1st Enoch and Jubilees,
Right.
what are you talking about? Where are these?
Where are these in terms of where they
we have these today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So 1st Enoch and Jubilees are 2 texts that we have copies of. Obviously, have them from the Qumran documents. But before this, we actually had copies in other languages: Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopic. We have different have these texts already, and you can go to find these. These are part of what we call the pseudepigrapha, the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. So you can go and you can read all these in English translations today. All these are preserved. What was interesting though about the scrolls is they finally gave us copies of books like this in Hebrew. We knew that they existed in Hebrew or Aramaic, one of the two, before this, but we didn't have copies. This gave us some of the earliest copies of Hebrew and Aramaic in these texts. So it's a very important text for early Jews. The fourth kind of text that we found were texts that were what we call sectarian texts. Now, this might be a word that's unusual. A sectarian group is just a group who is different in some ways from the wider society, popular beliefs. And because they're different in a lot of ways, they're often antagonistic towards outsiders. They have a negative view towards outsiders, possibly even other religious groups. And in some ways, that restricts their interaction with others. So they're very much into an in-group mode. Now, these are some texts that we found that before the scrolls were discovered, we had never seen any of these texts before. These were all new to us. So lots and lots of these texts were discovered. Now, I'm going to show you one example of the kind of text that we found. One of the kinds of texts that we found were called Pesher commentaries. Now, these are very interesting. Even at this time, so way back, even in the time of Jesus, it seems like commentaries were being made in a similar way that we do today. So you have the biblical text that would be quoted, and they would comment on those in some way. But what's different about these texts is this. Rather than trying to find, let's say, the historical significance, what they would do is they thought that the scriptural text was written for them specifically, so for their time. So they concentrated on the present day conditions and its application to them more so than the historical setting of the text. Now I'll give you an example. In this text, this is from Psalm 37. So this is a pesher on Psalm. It says, "The wicked plot against the righteous and gnashes his teeth against him. But the Lord laughs at him, for he knows his day is coming." Now, this was written long before these texts were written, writing about a historical situation in which the wicked and the righteous are fighting each other. But notice this. You have a quoting or citation of the scriptural text, and then the commentary. And it begins with the word pesher, which means its interpretation refers to, or its interpretation is this. And then you have the application, which is on this. This is the modern application. Its interpretation refers to the cruel Israelites in the house of Judah, who plot to destroy those who obey the law, who are in the party of the Yahad. But God will not leave them in their power. Now, what's going on here is this. The people that are writing this commentary are part of a group called the Yahad. And they're describing a situation which they're experiencing right now. And what they're claiming is this scriptural text is not written about anything, let's say, related to David or anything historical from the past. This story was written to talk to our situation. So this is talking about us right now and our enemies. Our enemies are predicted and discussed in the biblical text, and our deliverance is also predicted in the same text. This is how they read the scriptures. It's a very interesting way of reading the text. Now, there are lots of these. Most of the texts that we have come from the prophets. So a lot of them from the minor prophets, some from Isaiah, some from Psalms. So we have a lot of the prophetic texts that are discussed and talked about and applied to their life today. Now, I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is the second kind of text. This is called an ancient rule text. Now, in this text, these texts kind of regulate life in a particular community. It tells all the regulations, how meetings are set up, how you gain entrance. It's again, new to us. We had never seen these before. Now, here's one example. This is a text from the group called Community Rule. And it gives us kind of the rundown of what you need to do to get into this group. So it starts out with an examination period. The first thing you have to do is say, I want to be part of your group. If they agree to that, then you go through and take an oath. This is the oath that you would give according to this text. You would say, I will return to the law of Moses. So notice the language. You're returning to this. You're returning to following the law because they thought that in some way most people were not following the law correctly. So you return to the law of Moses with all my heart and with all my mind to all that has been revealed from it to the sons of Zadok and to the majority of the men of their covenant. So what they think is something has happened. God has revealed he's given special insight and revelation to this particular group to understand what the text really means and how you should live it out. And you have to commit to this if you're going to be part of their group. And once you take your oath, then you go through and take a test. It tests your physiognomy. Now, what this was is the group would get together and examine you, especially your facial features, your body features, and they would look at you because they thought that the way you looked, the way your body was structured, told whether you were part of God's community or you were part of the devil's community. You're good or bad based on what you look like. Now notice this text. Here's one of the texts. It says, and anyone whose eyes are, and it cuts off here so we can't see what it says, and they're long, but they are fixed, whose thighs are long and slender, whose toes are slender and long, and who was born during the second phase of the moon. He possesses a spirit, notice this, with 6 parts light, but 3 parts in the house of darkness. So you're partly good, you're partly bad, but since you're 6 parts good, it outweighs the 3 parts bad. That means you're okay, you can be part of us. And it's, again, all about the way you look. And that's how they determine whether someone got in or out. So they test that second. Lastly, they would have time to observe you. They would observe you for a while, and then they would vote. As a community, they would vote on you. Okay, you passed this, you passed this. All right, you look good. Now, again, this is just to get into the program. So once you pass this test, once you're approved, now you're into the program. Now you begin the actual training. So you train for a year, and this time you're restricted. You can't have part of their food. You can't be taking their drinks, or your property is separate from theirs. You're very much separated from them in a lot of ways. And this is the time they train you. They train you in all the ways, what they do, how they believe. If you pass that, then you go to the second year. The second year is much the same. Now you can take the food, notice, but you can still have the drink, and your property is still only mixed. But if you pass this, you're instructed again, if you pass that, good for you, then you enter into full membership. You have unlimited access, you can have full food, drink, your property is mixed with theirs, you're part of the group. Now, we learned that from that particular community rule text. Again, we'd never seen it before. Now, who were these authors? If that's what the kind of text that we're dealing with, who wrote them, or in some cases collected them, preserved them? Who were these people? Well, one of the clues to finding out who these were was this. You'll see here, this is a picture of the caves down in this area. These are caves all along through here. These are where some of the manuscripts were found. Well, we noticed above the caves, and actually there's a trail that leads to this, was the ancient ruins of a settlement, or just right above these caves. So we kind of pieced this together. This is called Kirbet Qumran. Now, if you put kind of some legs on this is what it looks like back then. So this is an ancient settlement. Notice, through archaeological excavation, this is what we discovered. They had a dining hall here. There was a cemetery out to the left side. There was what we call a scriptorium, which seems like some kind of writing was taking place in this room here. And we found lots and lots and lots and lots of ritual baths. These are places where you go and dunk yourself into the water to become ritually pure. This is the kind of settlement that these people are living in, and we noticed possibly a connection between this group and the scrolls that were discovered right below them. Now, who were they? Well, there are lots of different options of who they could have been. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. These are different groups that existed in the first few centuries. Well, most, though, identify this group as the Essenes. So the Essenes are the group probably responsible for these texts. Now, one of the I guess, confusing parts about this is this. We have this community here, but this community does not exhaust the Essenes. There were other Essenes that lived not just here, but around ancient Palestine in this time. So there were lots of different Essene groups, and in fact, many of them probably had different perspectives, different viewpoints, different theology in different ways. But there were lots of them living right here. But this was kind of, I don't know if this was their hub, this was a mainstay. This was an important part for this group. Now, in terms of where they came from, their history, a hypothesis, a theory has been constructed that kind of gives a rundown of how this community at Qumran probably developed. It starts with this. Around the year 110, so early 2nd century BC, there was a group that separated from everyone else in society. They thought they were different because of the things they believed about the law and about how to live, how to please God. They separated themselves, and they described themselves as wandering for about 20 years. All until a teacher arose. They call this man the teacher of righteousness. So he was the one who gave kind of shape to the group. He gave them some perspective, and this becomes now a full-blown sectarian community. Now with this, sometime around here, the Qumran community was established. We don't know exactly when they inhabited this place, but sometime along there it was established. And during this time, they began to write and preserve text. And many of the texts possibly came into the community from outside too. But around the year 76 BC, so 76 years before Jesus, we're talking Hyrcanus II, he became the high priest of the Jews. Well, with this, it looked like a positive for this group, because maybe he would come along and change things. At this time, the ruling group in the temple were doing things that this group did not like and did not agree with. They thought the temple was corrupt because of all the things that were going on. Maybe he would change things. So what would happen was they wrote a letter. They wrote a letter to Hyrcanus, kind of explaining their positions. This is why we do this. This is why we do this. This is what we believe. In hopes that he might change some things for them and set up things like they liked it. Well, the bad news is it didn't work, because it seems like that there was a threat after this on the life of the teacher. It turned out he was okay. He made it through that, but eventually the teacher dies. They don't gain control like they hoped. Well, he dies. After his death, they expected within 40 years, within a generation, something would happen. They expected the end of time to come, but it didn't. And this kind of dashed their hopes, it seemed like. Because around the same time, there was a massive earthquake that shattered some of the buildings and messed up some things. And this obviously couldn't have helped the situation, because nothing's happened. Because after this, they kind of go silent. There's not any of these predictions that we usually find. There aren't many historical references. They're not doing the same kind of things that they had been doing in the past. So, time goes forward a little bit. In 68 CE, so we're moving forward a little bit, the Romans come in. As I mentioned before, the Romans come in 70 and destroy everything. In 68, it seems like the Romans come in and to destroy, and this is the time when the community goes in and hides its material. They're hiding their text in these caves in hopes the Romans would not get them, and then eventually they could come back and collect the text later. Well, the problem is that didn't happen. The Romans came in and burned down their community, burned it to the ground, and left nothing alive. They probably killed any who were there. Some of the group probably escaped and went to Masada. We don't know for sure. But whatever happened, they didn't come back to get the text. And this is why they were left for us over 2,000 years later. And the Romans, it seems like, took up occupation of this for a long time thereafter. Now, I think that as far as the time, I think that I would go through and give you the rundown on what they believe, but I think that we're out of time for this. So I'll just take questions now. If you have questions now on this group, or I'll finish up with this. If you have questions about this group, the belief system I didn't get to. If you have questions on the history of the group, the text themselves, where they came from, the discovery, I'll be able to answer any of those for you if you have questions.
Would you mind, maybe take 5 minutes and show us what they believe?
Okay, sure. Sure.
Up to
Sure.
you. You guys okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, here's a rundown then on their beliefs, because some of them are actually very interesting. There are a couple of distinct features. So a couple of distinct features of what they believe. One of the most important was they held to an apocalyptic view of the world. This is an apocalyptic worldview. Now, this is what it is. Now, many of us probably, maybe have heard these views for so long it seems natural to us, but this was still a very new view. They thought that life on Earth was shaped by and dictated by supernatural forces, the forces of good angels, the forces of bad angels, demons. They were shaped, all the world around us was shaped by these forces. And the course of history was running towards a particular end. It wasn't cyclical, it was going towards a particular end, and that's when it would end. In that end, there would be a cataclysmic battle, a huge fight between good and bad. And they thought they were on the side of good. They would be fighting with God and his angels, and in that, after that, there would be judgment, and God would put down all of the bad. That was what they expected to happen any day at that point. In this situation, they were looking forward to messiahs. Now again, not a messiah, not a dying messiah, but they had actually different kinds of messiahs they were expecting. So one of the kind of messiahs they were expecting is a warrior king. The warrior king was a very common idea in that point, in that period. This would be a person who would come in, put down the Romans, destroy everyone, and they would set up a kingdom for them. There's also a different kind of messiah. There was a high priest or interpreter of the law, Messiah. He would come along, maybe even be more powerful than the warrior king Messiah, but he would be the one who tells them how they should live as the people of God. Another messianic figure that they thought of in the scrolls was an eschatological prophet, an end-time prophet similar to Elijah, who would come in and set up and do great miracles and those kind of things. And then finally, there was a heavenly Messiah, some kind of divine being from heaven coming down to earth. And what's interesting about these different pictures of what a Messiah would be is this, that the Christians came along and did this. The Christians took all of these different portraits of what different messiahs would do, and they applied all these pictures to Jesus. And the Christians then summarized Jesus as he is all of this for us, which is the unique thing about how they applied that to Jesus in the ancient world. That's the first thing. The second distinct feature is that they held to a deterministic view of the world, which means every human event, all of world history, was already fixed. So, if you were to ask different groups, do we act freely? The Sadducees might say, yes, we do. Pharisees would say yes, but the Essenes would say, no, you don't act freely. Or if you ask them, does every event have a cause? They might say no. The Sadducees would say no. The Pharisees would say yes, and the Essenes would say yes. So you don't act freely, and everything is caused. Now here's an example of what they mean by that. All that is now, ever shall be, originates with God of knowledge. Before things come to be, he has ordered all their designs, so that when they do come to exist, at their appointed times, as ordained by God, they fulfill their destiny, a destiny that's impossible to change. It's very interesting. So everything is fixed. It's going to happen exactly like God wants it to. The third thing is they believed in they were very strict in terms of the way they viewed purity. Now, purity is kind of hard to get your mind around, but there are two different kinds of purity. There's moral impurity, which is things that you can avoid, breaking of the law. If any one of the ordinary people sins, which is unintentionally doing any one of the things that by God's commands ought not to be done. So you break one of the rules. For example, if you rob a bank, that's going against one of the Ten Commandments. Don't steal. That's part of moral impurity. There's also ritual impurity, which is something that's kind of unavoidable. So in this case, this would be when a woman has a discharge of blood, that's her regular discharge. So a woman is on her menstrual cycle. She shall be in her impurity for 7 days. Now this is interesting because what they would do is they thought this brought on ritual impurity. They would quarantine women from this. You could not come and be near other people at this time. You could not partake in any kind of sexual activity, or you could not celebrate with everyone else. Now, in terms of how this looked and worked, they thought of impurity this way. God resided in the temple, and he was kind of like this consuming fire. His holiness was like a consuming fire. If you were impure, ritually or morally, this is kind of like you were doused with gasoline. You could not come near God because of your condition. But if you were pure, if you were maintaining purity, this is kind of like you're able to harness this power of God. And his holiness helped you to harness this kind of like with a flamethrower, if you will. Now, let's skip through some of this stuff. This is just showing how they compare with the Pharisees and other Christians. Before I get to this. Now, the point of this is just to show you that the Essenes were the most conservative of all the ancient groups. The Pharisees, even though they're described as legalists, was on the very far most liberal wing. The Essenes were the most conservative group of this. And the last thing, the last kind of theological distinctive that they held to was a different calendar. They held to a solar calendar rather than a lunar calendar, which was different from all other groups of Jews. Because by doing this, they thought that the priestly service in the temple, the fact that the priests run rotations at certain times of the year, and the religious holidays, there's Passover or Pentecost or whatever you're celebrating, all of these are off, and all of these are displeasing to God because they're off. Now, again, I mentioned to you that most Jews this time held to a lunar calendar. So they were on their calendar went by the moon. So their calendar had 12 months with 354 days total in the months. The problem, though, is obviously that you're missing 11 days. So what do you do if you're missing 11 days in your calendar? Well, according to this, if you think about it in terms of the cycle of the year and when certain holidays are celebrated. If you were celebrating, for example, the barley harvest, and the barley harvest happens first, well, what if you're 11 days off one year? The next year, you're 11 days off again. The next year, 11 days. By a few years, you're way off before there's any harvest to even celebrate. And this is a problem, obviously. So what the Qumran community did is they observed a solar calendar, which meant they had 364 days. Now I know it's not 365, but they had 364, which is important because this was divisible by 7. This allowed every single holiday to show up at the exact same time of the year. So, for example, Passover is celebrated the first month, 14th day, every year it's on a Tuesday. Or the harvest is celebrated month 3, day 6, every single year it's on a Friday. This is very important because they thought God is orderly and everything is on a precise timetable and everything should work and fit. And this is one of the reasons why they felt that everyone else, all the other groups, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, all of these are doing it incorrectly and therefore they're displeasing to God. God is the only one that loves us because we are the only ones who are listening and obeying Him like He has commanded. So that was a very fast run through of their beliefs. But now, do you have any questions based on that or anything else?
Is there a deterministic worldview similar to like a predestination?
It's very much like predestination. It's very much like that. Everything has a cause. God has already put things together. It's going to happen exactly like He wants it to. And in fact, notice the physiognomy. You look like this. That's telling you already you are destined to be either the house of the good or the house of the bad. You're either going to be a son of light or son of darkness. Before you were born, your body is showing you what you already are. So they just have to figure out what you are by looking at you and telling you you're good or bad. So it's already fixed. Yeah, it's very much like that. Yeah. Anything else?
Did I find any artifacts in these 10 caves? Because I watched the documentary films in the past, and they talk about the scenes where they hide at that time. And they found so many caves with so many artifacts, like balls, anything, to prove the people hide there. But in these 10 caves, anybody says any artifacts besides the scroll?
Sure. We found, like I mentioned before, we found all the jars, the scroll jars, which we also found at the site. But we also found parts of their clothing, those kind of things, sandals. We found combs and those kind of. Well, one of the things that we discovered from this, from doing this, it seems like this community itself, the settlement that I showed you, it wasn't very big. It couldn't house very many. What we think is many of the group probably lived in either tents around there, or maybe even in the caves. They lived in the caves, and some of their personal belongings. We found lots and lots of nails from sandals in a little walkway from between the caves and the settlement. So it seems like that many of them walked in the morning from the caves into the settlement and did their thing in the day, and then went back to the caves at night. Because we've, again, combs and different personal items that we found from them. And in one case, we found a piece of clothing that was white. Now you think that's not very important, but we know from other sources that this Essene group was known for wearing white to show their purity. We found a white piece of clothing, which was not very common back then, of course, as it is now, but we found that in one of the caves to show there's possibly a connection between the Essenes and this community too. Yeah.
And it's also mentioned about what material the text was written on, but I never heard about what kind of the ink or the pigments they used to write.
What they used to write? I can't remember what the exact thing offhand. I'm sorry. I'll have to look at it for you and get back to you.
Because it's never been faded. So.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, the good thing is that it was in the perfect climate to last. And I mentioned to you before, some of the jars were sealed and so it was very nice in an arid climate. It's not gonna have. Well, it's funny because even today, even with our technology today, we put them under perfect conditions. But even since our discovery, some of them have deteriorated even more so than what they had in the past because they were in a perfect condition before, and where they were in the caves. So even we have not had the kind of conditions, it seems like, to preserve them perfectly. So they will continue to decay, which is nice because we have digital photographs to preserve them.
I just thought maybe the ink has the blood or something if they use the technology to test this on the DNA or whatever.
We have, and I just off my head I can't remember what the kind of material it was. Any idea?
They used all kinds of different compounds according to the time, and they had different dyes, and so some of it was. Yeah, they would use mostly, if I remember right, plant-based. A lot of this was plant or chemical-based, or a combination thereof. But
Yeah, I can't remember offhand, honestly. I've got it written down in my notes, other notes, but not here, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why is it that, why do you think that, like, this was like one of the only groups to, preserve the text so well?
I think it maybe is a case of happenstance. I mean, this is the fact that it was hidden in these caves in a perfect condition. They got killed off probably, didn't come back for them. If you think about what would have happened if the Romans wouldn't have come in, or maybe the Romans hadn't killed them off, they come back, pick them up later, clear out the caves. What happened in that situation? They're probably used and then tossed away sometime through history. We never see them again, which is it's a very very interesting turn of events if that's the case. So it's what's interesting though, I think even more so, and Don takes the groups over to Israel in various archaeological digs. If you think about how we found this and what else might be out there, I mean, some of the caves that existed 2,000 years ago might have been covered over by now, and it might take an earthquake or some kind of storm to cut loose from the rock to show that something was there. Maybe there's something just waiting there in a cave, just like this, to be discovered next year. Who knows what we might find?
Yeah, it says Google real fast, the make up of ancient ink varies from time to time, from place to place. I mean, that's actually not only using carbon dating, but some of the other technologies. They actually can analyze the ink for that, but that doesn't answer, does it? Yeah, here's yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Just fantastic.